My name is Andreas Prins, and with me, I'm having today Meriem. Good to see you here.
Thanks for having me.
Meriem is having a lot of customer interactions, and she will join us today. It's a kind of an experiment, but she will be the voice of the customer, bring in a lot of the questions that we get from prospects, from customers, that we get at trade shows, and see if we can make it that way a bit more interactive than just presenting me for full 45 minutes. What are we going to cover today? Well, the interesting topic today will be about building a holistic observability strategy, or if you like, a 360 observability strategy, because ultimately the purpose or what we need to do is enhance reliability across the board, not only in your dev teams or not only in the network operations center, not only for your cloud native technology, but for all your technologies out there, for the disciplines that are in there. And what we would like to do today is take lessons learned from more than 50 customer conversations and bring that into this webinar. And the setup today is super simple. We're just going to cover 3 different sections: the human, people, the process, and the technology. And then each of these 3 sections, we dive deeper into 3 topics, if you like, that we think are very important to consider. And for the ones who recognize this marble statue on the slide, this is Socrates. And the twist of today is not only to give you all the answers, but also to empower you with 9 different questions that you can use throughout your conversations with your teams to actually have a good and deep conversation on how to build that super solid observability strategy. Because what I believe and what we've learned is that having these conversations will truly spark the ability to step-by-step further improve the reliability across your entire tool chain and across the technology stack that is out there. So, what are we going to cover? The first one is all about the human element. What are the roles involved? How do you actually think about knowledge sharing when it comes down to observability? And last but not least, how do you drive collaboration across all these different roles? The second section will all be about the process. And often, if you think about the process, we as humans take a very narrow piece of that process, because that's what we know. And I hope that today's webinar will help you to understand the broader perspective when it comes down to observability processes. How do you think about issue resolution? How do you think about time to value for your observability strategy? And last but not least, how to tighten the different perspectives of all the roles involved. And then third, we're going to cover 3 topics with regards to technology. First, your landscape isn't cloud native as a whole. There are numerous technologies. How do you cover them from that observability strategy? Secondly, there's more than health. What is it? And what do we need to do there? And last but not least, what if I have multiple telemetry sets? How do I bring them together? All right, let's get started with the first one, and that is the human element. But before we get into that, it would be really nice to also learn from you out there in the field. So let's set up a poll, and it would be amazing if you can start replying and responding there. All right. The first polling question is, where do you foresee is the biggest improvement in your observability strategy? Is that A, on the human element, B, the process, or is that really on the technology and the tool stack, or is that in any other? And it would be nice to see actually where you think the biggest benefit or your biggest investment would be if you have to improve this. All right, answers coming in. Well, that's kind of a nice distribution. Not that much on the human element. That's very interesting. So I would really hope that this conversation or this webinar would kind of change your mind when it comes down to the human element. Definitely process as expected and the technology. And then, well, some other. Not a surprise, process and technology focus. All right, let's go back to the slides and let's use this information in a little bit to go over that. The first thing, are we screen sharing still?
See the slide now.
Sorry, that's my fault. It's never. There we go.
Thanks. Yeah, perfect.
All right, let's take a closer look at the humans involved. And the first very interesting thing that we get back from our customers, or actually from all of our engagements, is that really depending on who you're speaking to, there is a different need in the organization when it comes down to observability. And prior to me joining the field of observability 2.5 years ago, I thought observability is observability, right? And that depending on who you are, the need is roughly the same. One of my biggest key takeaways in the recent years is that depending if you're speaking to the platform team, the development team, the application or product owner, or even the network operations center, they all have a different need when it comes down to observability because they are wired in a different way and they see the world in a different way. The platform team, for example, is very technical oriented. Are my cloud systems up and running? What about memory and CPU usage? What namespace is running where? What is communicating with what? But all approached from a technical infrastructure perspective. The dev team, for example, brings a different need. They don't care too much about the lowest levels. So they really focus on the resources, the services, the components that together form the application. And the network operations center, well, they will take an even broader look. They just pay attention to, are my mission critical chains up and running? What are the business applications that are communicating with each other? And if you put these questions or perspectives next to each other, you'll quickly learn and realize that indeed they do have a different need. And that brings me to a question that you could ask to your audience, to the people that you're working with. Assess how you could tailor the observability tools to better serve the needs of our unique team members. That's a question you can bring with you to your teams later today, tomorrow, or next week. And I'm curious, Meriem, with regards to this topic, what do we see there?
Yeah, I have a question of my own when it comes to this. So for customers who are kind of starting their observability journey, what do you think in greenfield scenarios is the best place to start with observability and to start that implementation? Which team, which area?
Yeah, that is actually a good question. And with me being a former consultant, I would first answer it depends. But it depends. So let me give various angles to that.
Okay.
So the first one is, imagine you have a very mature platform team, right? That is very well established in all the tools that they need to master the platform layer. Mm-hmm. Probably the biggest bottleneck is not with the platform team, if you speak about a holistic observability strategy, but more with your development teams that deploy their apps to the cluster. So then I would recommend to start at that level.
Yeah, makes sense.
If you're much further down into the journey and your platforms start to scale and tens of teams start to deploy to your cloud layer, well, you might consider building also a very robust and scalable approach there, because you're probably not with one single platform team managing your entire platform. So you need probably multiple of them. Mm-hmm. The other perspective could be, if you are, every company these days runs mission critical software, but imagine that you are having numerous outages kind of at the bigger business application chain end-to-end level. Well, then you might consider investing more time and effort first, right, in building that holistic big picture, for example, based on Splunk data in combination with StackState, rather than the lower levels.
Yeah.
Ultimately, our lesson learned is that all these aspects often relate a lot to each other, because an issue that you face at a higher level in your network operations center is often triggered, obviously, by the deeper down issues in your application or even further down in your stack.
So to further onto that, you've spoken about a lot of different teams. Does that mean that we then need different observability tools to speak to each of the different needs of different teams, or is one observability tool enough?
Well, that also again depends. If you're starting small, mm-hmm. right, with your observability and you're just having 5, 6, 7 development teams pushing to the cloud layer, I definitely recommend a single solution to bridge the different perspectives, because it's probably not yet worth in spending a lot of time and effort in various solutions, right? Because
Yeah.
it's still small in size. On the contrary, even if you're super big, right, you all speak about the same data, right? So you want to have a different angle on that data, but still, if you start to put multiple data sources in place, it gets more difficult to get that unified picture, and also more difficult to drill down from a high level all the way deep down to a lower level. So also there, we've seen very successful implementations with numerous roles using the same observability solution that is out there.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Perfect.
Definitely.
Makes sense. Thank you.
I recently talked to a Gartner analyst, and he mentioned that only if your investment goes above 10 million from an observability perspective, then you could consider building solutions yourself. But everything that stays below that limit, just take something that is available on the market and use that. Yeah. Good question. All right, let's take the second element of the human. And that is all around knowledge sharing. And this is probably a very fundamental piece if you're a little further down in your observability journey. And that is paying attention to knowledge sharing. And if we rewind a little bit, go back in time, when we had the whole infrastructure as code movement, when we had the pipelines as code or the application definitions as code, we were very used to articulating the state in a snippet of code and put that into our Git repositories. And that is a way then to share knowledge, because all of a sudden your knowledge is captured in code and every team can use your pipeline definition or your application definition and just start rolling out the cluster, the application, or the pipelines. And one of the important things to consider is, if we are more and more maturing in the observability space, is should we use similar practices when it comes down to observability? So are there ways where, let's say, the platform team or the site reliability engineering team can capture their knowledge into observability policies as code, put it in a code repository, and then every other team that needs to use that can apply that? And that was a philosophy that really triggered us as StackState, is to think that through. Rather than every team creating its own dashboards and its own policies or monitors, how we call them, can we find a way that you define them once and then within an enterprise roll it out very, very easily? And then the question you can ask to your teams or with your teams or in your team is, what can we do to boost our knowledge sharing and ensure that everyone's expertise benefits the whole team? Because it would be a pity if you have great ideas on how to build an observability policy, but not able to share that. And that knowledge sharing piece, I feel, is sometimes a little bit, diminished or not present enough. Probably because many companies are still in the early days of figuring out how to build an observability strategy. But also what we notice is the platform teams and the SRE teams often very well know what to do, but haven't found a way to bring that to all the development teams that start to deploy towards their platform. So that's my second takeaway from all these conversations that we've had, is focus on knowledge sharing.
That was a big topic at KubeCon last month. So a few of the managers that I spoke to, particularly in platform teams, were talking about knowledge gaps, right? How there are these massive knowledge gaps across the organization. And they really felt like their team's expertise wasn't really properly utilized. So you've spoken a little bit about the importance of being able to knowledge share. But in your opinion, what are some concrete ways that we can better share expert information across our organizations so that that knowledge gap can be shortened down?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And to me, it consists out of two. One, it's how do you capture the knowledge, right? So you need to find proper ways, like as code, to create actually policies that are shareable, right? That are easy format to share, rather than, because then it's leaving, right, the mind and the brain of the people, and all of a sudden it's able to be shared. So that's one important aspect. Yeah. The second one is still the traditional knowledge sharing, right? Because you can have a policy, but if you've no idea what it means, when to apply, how to use it, it's actually still close to useless. So if you can find a way in your organization to have lunch sessions like this one, but then really tech focused, that could work very, very well. And then there is the library of policies, right, as code that the teams can just take. And then the second one is with knowledge sharing, you actually can build an understanding of what it means.
Yeah.
At StackState, we add 1/3 layer there. And that is if, let's say, your platform team has articulated such a policy and would flip it on, then every workload that is deployed towards the cluster will immediately get under the supervision of that particular policy. And that means when development teams who are lacking deep observability knowledge, because they have a lot of development expertise, they still benefit from that policy that is already switched on, that observability practice. So that is a third one is, are there ways to, in a non-intrusive way, force or toggle on particular policies that all your development teams will benefit from? It's really about, on one hand, the creation, and on the second side, the knowledge sharing as humans amongst each other.
Yeah.
And then the third aspect is really about collaboration, because it's cool to have a clear picture on all the roles involved. It's nice to do a lot of knowledge sharing, but then sometimes there is an issue. And then the question is, how is your process shaped to drive a really smooth collaboration when it comes down to solving and remediating these issues? And here's just an example. So imagine you are an on-call engineer in the network operations center, or even in the development team, where you follow the mantra of you build it, you run it. And you receive that alert, and then all of a sudden, right, the team who is on call potentially need to be involved, because the engineer is a single person, but if he doesn't develop that particular application, he's reaching out to the team who has created that application. And then quite swiftly, you'll see the whole flow starting up. A Slack channel where you have the continuous conversation going on, where people drop in information and where you have the conversation, in particular when we are distributed like today. But also sometimes it's not only the dev team, but also the operations team that need to be involved. If there's still a split between these two disciplines, involve them as early as possible. And then tools like ServiceNow are most likely used to manage and to reach out to them. And that is a cycle that we feel is often still pretty doable. But then there are two very important topics to take into account, and that's the post-mortem. So as soon as the issue is resolved, you really need to take a deep look on what was wrong, why did it go wrong, and what is it actually that I need to do to prevent it. Likewise, then involving the development team to build a permanent fix, or actually to really solve the issue that is out there. And that will close the loop from an initial issue resolution to ultimately building something that's more robust, reliable, to at the end, prevent that from happening again. And only if you are aware of all these roles, I do believe that it will get better. What we encounter in many conversations speaking to either the platform or the development teams or the operations team is that we still use our own tools and are still very much focused on our piece of the process. And I really recommend having the conversation with your team to think about the collaboration across your team. Outside the team that you are in, how do you engage with the others? Because ultimately, and this is super important, observability strategy is all about ensuring reliable applications. So imagine the application there at the heart of that circle. How do you prevent, right, that application is down or having issues? You really need to solve that as quickly as possible. And it's important for you to have that conversation. What do we see here on this aspect, Meriem, in the field?
I don't actually have a specific question on this one, but I am curious. Do you have an example maybe of where you've fostered better collaboration, whether it's in StackState or previous lifetime, or an incident that you learned from that really taught you this lesson and how important it is?
Yeah, and for me, this circle only became really valuable, I would say, when I started the practice of doing postmortems. And that was about 7 years ago when I was at the bank, at ING, large bank here in the Netherlands and Europe, when we had a couple issues with our application, when the business owner wasn't satisfied. And then we started to do this very deep analysis. How did it happen? What went wrong? and what are the ways to prevent this issue, but also similar issues from happening again. And what I realized back then is you can only do a really good post-mortem if you involve all the different disciplines that are engaged in building and operating these applications. And the first few times, it's a time-consuming process, and it also hurts a little bit because you need to set aside your egos. But as soon as you get used to that, you start to enjoy the collaboration and figuring out how to make it better and how to build that stairs going up from a reliability perspective rather than a spiral going down. Yeah.
That's a great example. 10 minds are better than one.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right. Although not a lot of you voted for the process as an important, the human element as an important element, I do hope that there are a couple good nuggets in there that you can take, a couple good questions, and actually spark a conversation with your teams and with your coworkers. All right. With having said that, let's move towards the process, because people is one, but process is also very important. And let's start with a polling question again. What is your number one challenge when it comes to speeding up the detection and resolution of issues? Is that identifying the root cause, coordinating between teams, using the right remediation tools, integrating insights into actionable steps, or anything else? All right. Identifying the root cause with a clear 60%, coordinating between teams, and using the right remediation tools. That is an interesting one. And you might expect, or I would say, with so many tools out there and already so much experience with observability or even monitoring, that you would expect that finding the root cause gets easier and easier. But all the time, and these numbers are no surprise to me, all the time finding the root cause remains the struggle. And that's very well might due to the knowledge, that might be due to the fact that there's so many disciplines involved or that the collaboration isn't so strong. But identifying the cause of the issue is really important. And if we take a look at our first subject here, accelerate issue resolution, the Site Reliability Engineering Handbook provides a very clear and structured way to assess a situation, to remediate as quick as possible, and then also even to fix it permanently. And this is an important lesson learned for me, I would say 1.5 years ago only, is to split a permanent fix versus making it work again for the end customer. This is the difference. The first goal for engineering teams should be is to restore operation, even if that's with a quick hack in the back, if that's applying a lot of memory to make the machine run, if that's an ugly restart, or if that's cleaning up stuff manually. If you're able to restore the business operations, that is of the uttermost importance. And then, obviously, do the post-mortem or the real root cause analysis and find the cause of the issue and solve the issue there as well. But having that distinction in mind can sometimes help to much faster restore customer experience or customer operations, while at the same time looking for the cause of the issue. The beauty of the Site Reliability Engineering Handbook is this simple process. And it's all focused on, as quick as possible, triaging all the information that comes in to prioritize what takes the most priority. Taking in the data and really examine and diagnose the issue. Because if you're able to follow this process very structured, you get to the conclusion on what to do as fast as possible. And at StackState, when we work on our solution, when we think about observability, we really aim to help our users support this process. And that is different, and that's an important remark to make, that is different than just having a dashboard and an alert. The question is, what are the ways to guide the user towards resolving the issue? And for StackState, here we introduced, for example, the concept of remediation guides. And a guide is aiming to help you go through this process as quick and fast as possible. And this is also where the different knowledge of the different roles involved come into play. Yeah, because if you have an issue which might reside on the application side or on the more infra-oriented side, well, you really need the expertise of both sides. But if you have a single solution that brings the data together, it will be much easier and faster to resolve it. And I can really recommend to do a little bit of reading on this process and really understanding what is actually going on. The key question here is, what strategies could we adopt to speed up our issue detection and resolution process? Because if you start to figure out what is needed in your organization, ultimately you will resolve issues much faster for your customers. So that's the first one when it comes down to the process.
I'm just wondering, Andreas, so obviously with StackState, we've got the remediation guides, and I think that's one of the things that I think we are very unique in, that we have taken it from just alerting you of an issue to actually helping you cure that issue. What I find being new, obviously the observability space myself, a lot of observability platforms are still focused on alerting you that something is wrong, and they haven't really tapped into helping you diagnose and remediate that issue. I'm wondering, as an expert in this field, why do you think that is? Why is the root cause and identifying it still so high?
That's a really good question. And I do think that we should go back much further in time, right? When we didn't speak about observability, but much more about monitoring. The studio is collapsing here, I think.
I think it might be.
A lot of alarms start to beep.
My mic, maybe? We're all good.
All right, we're still here and still alive. So the question here from Meriem, sorry for being disrupted. Yeah, I have someone looking here around the corner. The question from Meriem is, why are we still so much focused on dashboards and alerts? And we should go back much longer in time when we only spoke about monitoring, when we only collected some metrics or some logs to identify what is actually wrong with my application, when there were only a few experts who could interpret these signals and deal with that. And although much more data has come into play, metrics, event, logs, trace, change information, our brain, I do think, is sometimes still wired. We want to assess and crunch data ourselves without following a structured approach. So I do think there's a kind of the historical perspective to that. The second, with AI coming up, there are quite a bit of players who start to do event correlation.
Yeah.
We'll speak about it a little later. So with the rise of AI, it becomes easier to let the machine do the interpretation rather than the human. But still, right, it's quite intense to do that.
Yeah.
My recommendation only is to start thinking in a different way, to become effective in a fresh and modern way of doing observability. Yeah. The second element when it comes down to the process, and this is probably a little bit unexpected, it's not only about solving issues. The second one, which is really important, is also think about the speeding up the time to initial value. And you might wonder, initial value to what? Well, to coming to a strong observability strategy or tool stack, if you like. And what we've learned from many conversations with prospects at KubeCon, at other shows, also with our customers, is thinking about time to value. We predominantly think about that top circle, the select. Really thinking about what is needed to get started with observability. And three other aspects, in our opinion, are often forgotten. What about the onboarding, the config? What if you need to onboard numerous teams? Is the tool able and ready enough to very quickly get new teams up and running in the solution? The second is, if they are up and running, is how do you actually educate and train them? And we've talked about education already a little bit, but that is a very important topic, not only from an observability perspective, but also how do you use the tool that you've selected to become very structured and effective. And then the third aspect, or the fourth if you like, but the third forgotten aspect is innovation. Because often we select a tool for the existing need that we have in the organization, but we forget how our landscape will evolve, and we forget how our organization will evolve, and we forget how the observability practice with all its standards evolves. And then the question is, do you pick a tool for today, or do you pick a tool that will mature alongside your organization and your tool stack? And I would recommend to start thinking about tool selection, or more in particular observability tool selection, much more this way. And at StackState, we've learned that innovation can happen in a tool, like StackState, for example. And then by using that, we ship that every time with every release towards our customers. When it comes down to education, we've developed a 1-hour workshop where, with very nice challenges or labs, if you like, new teams are getting familiarized with the StackState UI, with our philosophy, with some of our key ingredients. And similar for configuration, we found ways to very quickly onboard teams into StackState. So the focus is on building the observability practice and not necessarily on growing and maturing a particular tool. So that is an important one to realize. And then the key question here is, how can we choose observability tools that are easy for our teams to adopt and start getting value from right away? Because ultimately, that is what matters. The goal is not to spend endless hours in selecting tools. The goal is to build a reliable infrastructure and a reliable application landscape to serve your end customer needs in the very best way that is possible.
Andreas, from my perspective, working with a lot of customers, we do a lot of these trials with customers and prospects, right? And oftentimes they can be quite unstructured, and there's not really a major understanding of the needs and the requirements needed. How do you think we can better structure those processes for better outcomes in trials when choosing observability platforms?
Yeah, that is a good one. From my expertise, from what we see is that often when we engage with prospects, is that we predominantly speak about the top, right? What are the kind of the selection criteria?
Yeah.
But there's not really a structured evaluation strategy when it comes down to all these 4 aspects. One, but also not how do you assess particular key capabilities. Yeah? An example, you see the requirement of, it needs to support OpenTelemetry, because we're using OpenTelemetry as an instrument to collect and gather data. However, what is it that you want to do with OpenTelemetry throughout the process, right? What dashboards do you want to get out of that? What are the alerts you want to see there? So it's not only about checking the box from a technical perspective, but really understanding the 4 aspects as listed here, but also one step further. If I have OpenTelemetry, what is it that I want to do with that observability tool? And my recommendation for everyone who starts a tool investigation to really think about that, write that down, because that would give you a much better understanding how your solution can grow along the way with you doing the implementation as well as maturing the observability practice.
Yeah, understood.
So that is from a initial time to value, from a process perspective. And then the last element is absolutely super important, and that is synchronizing between the different perspectives. And I mentioned the different roles in the human element, the one where we started with in the first picture. The other one is these 3 roles, or the levels, they bring different needs. And the first one is that end-to-end picture. How are my business applications interacting with each other? And can I visualize in my observability solution, can I visualize actually that end-to-end picture? And can I get alerts on my business application level if one application is having issues? And can I understand what is the impact, kind of the blast radius, to my other applications that are connected? And that's a whole new way of thinking, because often we take a look at a technology, at the particular resource, at the workload, without understanding that mission critical chain of applications. And StackState is able to help you. The second one is actually having a deep understanding of that one single application that is out there, the blue circle. Really understanding if something is wrong with my application, or there are some users in a particular region complaining, how can I actually understand what is wrong with my application? You can think about application performance monitoring, building that deep understanding of what is needed there. And then the third element is not only about the chain and the single application, but it's also about the technology stack that is underneath that particular application, and the interaction actually between the tech stack and the application itself. And if you're able, Meriem, you asked that question earlier, is where would you start? Well, ultimately, I do think you should start somewhere, but where it should really end up with is this connected picture where 3 different perspectives are being brought together for that holistic understanding. And that's often forgotten because we start from one role, from one discipline, and we try to understand that from that particular role rather than the broad picture. So the question here to ask as Socrates tomorrow to your teams is, how can we better integrate the various viewpoints within our teams, from the control room to the developers and even down to the platform teams, to ultimately pinpoint the cause of the issue as fast as possible to be able to restore the customer service as quick as possible.
Yeah, that's brilliant, because I usually find it difficult to actually explain why it's important and the impact of having all of these 3 different perspectives together. So it's great that you've elaborated a little bit more on it, because I think having that holistic overview really is what you want to achieve, and be able to have full sight, not just kind of distorted visibility within your environment. So thank you for elaborating on that.
Yeah, and to go even deeper on that, an engineering team can sometimes even say, no, technically, my application still works. It's still there. Right? Whereas then, for example, the business starts to complain, but people from region Germany or from the UK, they don't have a decent service level anymore, right? So from a technology perspective, it could still work fine. But at the business level, we're facing issues. So how are you able to match the 2 worlds, right? And it very well might be that a new deployment, a new version of the application technically works, but is providing service disruption towards the end users. So having then the 2 perspectives combined gives you indeed that clear picture and detail.
Yeah, makes sense.
All right, then the technology. We've spoken about the human, we've spoken about the process, and then obviously, right, there's a little bit more to the game, and that's all about technology. How do we actually build that deep understanding? And the first element to address, I would say, is to think about the world as there's more than just cloud native technology. We all know that in larger enterprises, but also in small, it's definitely not a homogeneous technology stack, but there are all different type of flavors of technology. And that's something to address. How do I cover my message queues, my databases, my VMs, right, that are running under the workloads? And really important is, what about multi-cluster? What if my app runs across multiple clusters? How do I actually visualize and observe that entire system? And how do I ensure multi-cloud observability? Because very well could be that you're using Azure and AWS, or that you're using AWS and GCP as layers, as infrastructure to operate your applications on. And then having an understanding of how your application is using all these resources is super important. And if you select a solution, I really recommend to pick one that can cater for all the different type of technologies that are out there, because otherwise it's really hard to build that holistic picture that we talked about in the previous one. And obviously there are standards coming to the market, like OpenTelemetry, that would help you big time covering all these different technologies. But then still, your engineering teams need to start instrumenting your applications with OpenTelemetry libraries, so that might be pretty time consuming. At StackState, we believe that it's actually a mix of technologies that are required to build that holistic picture beyond Kubernetes. So on one hand, we're supporting OpenTelemetry, but it can be a little bit intrusive for the engineering teams to do things. And at the other hand, we're using eBPF as a very non-intrusive way to already build your end-to-end picture, how services communicate and connect, as well as to collect already some metrics, like the golden signals, to have a quick understanding, more from a business perspective, how your services perform. And that is then, if you merge that together, that really gives you that clear picture of all the resources that are out there in your cluster. And that's something I recommend to definitely look into. So the question here to answer is, considering that our stack consists out of more than just Kubernetes, what is actually our monitoring strategy or observability strategy and tool stack that I want to apply to get this picture?
as we speak a little bit about OpenTelemetry and eBPF, I actually have a question here from Natalia.
Yeah.
And she asks, could you provide an example when you applied StackState to the low latency system? And what was the telemetry setup? Was there any implications to the system performance? It's a very detailed question.
It is. And probably Ravon can answer that in the chat in a much more technical aspect. I would like to answer that a bit more in general from an OpenTelemetry perspective. There's a lot of telemetry being created today already, right? There's an overload of metrics coming to the system, an overload of log information. And the question really is for teams who start to use OpenTelemetry is to really think through what are the metrics I actually need to build my observability strategy. So what is it that I need to pay attention to from a monitoring perspective that would say something about my system's health or other characteristic of the system? And if you start applying OpenTelemetry, take it from that perspective and really instrument your code with the metrics that matter to that perspective. That is from a high-level perspective, and then I would like to challenge Ravon to go one step deeper in the chat. All right. Let's do our next polling question, and that to me is probably one of the more exciting ones to understand where everyone is. And the question is, what type of data insights are most critical for your Kubernetes operations? Are these performance metrics, security vulnerabilities, configuration changes, or resource utilization? And this time, sadly, there's no other to pick from. What type of data insights are most critical for your Kubernetes operations? All right. Performance metrics, security vulnerabilities, and configs are equally distributed, and then resource utilization. And that last one I absolutely recognize also in many of the engagement and the conversations we're having. The world is no longer only about health, but we really start to focus on cost and actually the optimization of resources, because we want to bring down the footprint, one for budgetary reasons, and obviously also to have the least amount of footprint from a carbon perspective. So if you can optimize there, that's absolutely beneficial. I would like to give even a broader perspective than just this polling question. So if you think about observing the health of your application, the reliability, that is super important, because that tells you or that says something about how your end customer would experience it from an uptime, from a performance, from a stability perspective. However, there are, in our opinion, a couple more layers that you should address and that you could consider when you think about that holistic 360 observability strategy. And the first layer is diving more into security and compliance. It's not only about the reliability of your application, but you could argue if it's insecure, it's also not reliable from a security perspective. So paying attention to security, the vulnerabilities, the access to data, etc., as well as compliance, who changed what at what moment in time and what is the version that is out now in production. From an observability perspective, you should be able to master these two perspectives. One level deeper is not only security compliance, but also taking the perspective from a business metrics or even an end user experience, right? And there are many practices out there with setting the right SLAs, service level agreements, and SLIs, service level indicators. There are ways to measure, for example, how many tickets you're selling or how many abandoned carts. But really starting to merge these business metrics into your observability stack will build a good understanding of how your application is actually performing. Because it very well could be that from a reliability perspective, everything is running very smooth. But if not a lot of end users can actually execute the task at hand, signing up for a mortgage or a savings account, it becomes really difficult for them to actually do what they need to do. So getting these signals into your observability solution and putting the right monitors or policies, if you like, on top of that will really help you to build that bigger picture. And then last but not least, also the events that are created more in your IT environment. Think about change management information from your CMDB, from ServiceNow type of tools, or think about CI/CD events. These are also important to bring into your observability strategy because that would help you to build that bigger picture. So go beyond health, the top bar, and really focus on the 3 layers that are underneath. And the question to ask and to discuss with your teams is what are ways to actually integrate these signals into your observability strategy, because that would give you that holistic picture.
Andreas, can you give a concrete example of incorporating security, compliance, and alerts with your observability strategy?
Yeah, so for example, at StackState, we integrate with Prisma Cloud, with Falco, with NeuVector, who are really involved in detecting and scanning containers to see if there are any vulnerabilities in there. And from a security perspective, if you find these containers, you might want to pull them down, right? Because then you're satisfied from a security perspective. However, that might disrupt the customer experience. So if you're not aware of these actions happening by your security tools from a regular observability perspective, your development teams actually don't know what to do or what happened, right? So what is the cause of the issue? So if you can stream these events into your observability solution, in our case, into StackState, the development teams have actually a much broader perspective of the total behavior of the application. And StackState, for example, is not a container scanning tool, so we're not doing that. But using these signals into StackState is absolutely useful to get that full picture.
Yeah, thank you.
And then one other aspect that came into my mind is more from a CI/CD. Why would you take CI/CD signals into your solution? Well, often change information is valuable to judge or to determine whether or not there was a change being made to my system. And if so, what was actually the pipeline that triggered that? So by integrating these CI/CD signals into your observability solution, you get a better picture of the changes happening and can much faster drill down to the particular change that was made. So also considering these signals into your observability timelines is very powerful. And StackState does that as well with tools like Tekton or any other tool that you use for CI/CD. All right. And then the last one, and that's probably one of the most complex ones to see first in the picture, but I will guide you through this rather quickly. It's not only about going beyond Kubernetes or going beyond that health signal, but I would also like to challenge you to go beyond distinct data sets. Meriem asked the question, why are we still so focused on dashboards and alerts? Well, probably because we're wired that way. But what if you would have at the bottom of this pyramid numerous data sets? Metrics, events, log, trace, change information, config information. So the full data set that is out there. If you would put dashboard straight on top of that, you would get alerts, but you actually have limited insight into the cause of the issue. And looking at the previous poll or 2 polls ago, that is super important for all of you, being able to identify the cause of the issue. At StackState, we believe that there's a very important step often forgotten, and that is how do you structure the data in the next 2 layers to actually gain very clear insights on what is going on. And at StackState, we first derive topology, or if you like, a dependency map. And that is needed to understand how all resources are related to each other. What are the dependencies? Who is dependent on what? How's information flowing through your system? And if you're able to derive from these distinct data sets that uniform topology, all of a sudden, troubleshooting becomes already 10 times easier because you can just navigate a tree structure down to find the cause or to travel it up to see the impact towards your end customers. And at StackState, we then correlate all the data towards the topology. So that makes navigation of data much easier because if you are assessing a dashboard of a service, you have all the information that belongs to the service there. If you drill down to the pod, all of a sudden you get a different data set. You get your events, your logs. If you go to a container, again, you get different data because every resource has different metrics, have different insights required. And for us, these 3 layers are fundamental to go from a fragmented data set towards a refined data set. But that's not about it. We talked about knowledge, why knowledge sharing is so important and why you should consider or could consider to put that into your observability solution. And at StackState, we've introduced monitors, these observability policies, as well as remediation guides to drive issue recognition and the layer above, the remediation. And if you think about using the data, it's not to have the data with the dashboard, but the goal really is to assess issues that arise in your landscape as fast as possible, and then find a way to troubleshoot what's going on. And that's where the remediation guides are super helpful. And if you're more ambitious, hook up your CI/CD pipelines or your other automation tools to drive resolution. At StackState, we believe that you have already established processes, so we recommend to connect into them to drive resolution where needed. And then the question is, you could ask yourself or the teams, is what are the approaches that we could consider to break down these data silos and really build that integrated perspective? Because what we've learned from all of our customers, if you're able to do so, you can much faster troubleshoot any issues that arise in your landscape.
So we spoke a little bit about topology. What are some different ways that we can actually correlate these data sets to be able to gain better insights?
Yeah.
Is it just topology? Is there more to it?
Yeah. So at StackState, we are a firm believer of topology and deriving topology first, because that's relatively, and it doesn't require a lot of resources, compute and memory to do. So we first derive the topology and then we correlate all the metrics. If you don't have let's say a graph database under your observability platform to do so, we see a lot of AI to do event correlation. It's much more compute intense than building a simple structured way of doing that. But that's certainly a way to do it. But there's also quite a bit of work to make that happen. So there's the AI way to get from unstructured data to good insights. And then there's the first structure the data over the angle of topology to build that bigger picture.
It's a more simpler way of doing it.
Yeah, definitely. And the topology is not only simpler to structure the data, but also super powerful. What I mentioned, to navigate from a high level, hey, the customer is experiencing something, what is the cause of the issue? Because you can wire the dashboards very easily together without the human needing to understand how my tech stack looks like.
Yeah.
And if you have an issue at the deep down component, right, you can super fast travel up, right, into the business domain. Remember, the gray and the blue circles forming your business process. So you can also much easier correlate, okay, what is my impact at my business level that is out there. Yeah.
Great.
All right. Conscious of time, if there are any questions, please drop them in the chat. There's still room for a few. But before we get there, let's do our last polling question, and that's more forward-looking. What is your organization's priority for the next 12 months regarding IT infrastructure? Is that actually observability listed as the number 2? Or is it much more focused on security, on scaling operations because more and more development teams start to deploy towards your cloud platform? Or is it all about cost reduction? Because we could have talked about these other topics as well. Today was all about observability. And I really hope you enjoyed it. Let's get to the answers. Enhance security, improve observability and monitoring with almost a 60% and cost reduction. Yeah, and probably the poll isn't right and people are biased because the topic was all about observability and now realize. We should probably treat it with a pinch of salt. Is that an English saying as well?
Yeah, it is.
Well, it's absolutely Dutch. So, all right. Let's go back to the last slide and then see if there are any questions popping in. There's not only the recording that you will receive after this webinar. We've also written a small blog post in which we cover these 3x3 subjects that you could consider while enhancing a super reliable observability strategy. So use the QR code to get there or go to blog.stackstate.com and find it there as well. Are there any?
Yeah, we've got 2 more questions that I'd like to ask you. So one question here asks, could you provide an example of the most complex issue you've come across in a large distributed system? And how did you resolve it? Big question.
It's really a big question.
4 minutes, no pressure.
Yeah. So for me, it's a little while ago that I've been operating my engineering teams as such. What I recall, the biggest issues is with components that come and go. So in the past, we had these beautiful monoliths that were super stable in a sense. They were always there. These days, with workloads coming and going to our clusters with containers or even serverless, it becomes harder and harder to pinpoint what was causing the issue, because the container that caused the issue might have been gone already. So if you only assess the now, you don't know actually what happened in the past. And that's also a little bit why StackState has developed the ability to travel back in time, not only have metrics, right, that go back in time, obviously, but also be able to see the state of your cluster a little back in time. And we recommend, hey, if you do a post-mortem, that you start troubleshooting kind of, or start understanding at your green situation, so prior to the issue, and then second by second, start to replay what actually happened, what were the changes that were made, and that is happening.
Yes.
The other element that comes into my mind is sometimes something can happen from a business perspective. I mentioned that before. Particular users can't access it.
Yeah.
But at the deeper technical level, you don't see anything. And that's where then trace information becomes super powerful, because you can start to determine, hey, what population, right? Where does it come from? What are the characteristics that might face issues? So that's another angle that can be pretty complex.
Thank you so much. And I'll end with this question. So is data reliability part of the offering? And if yes, could you specify what is the approach to mitigating data traction?
The answer is data reliability part of the offering. I think that the question is pointed to StackState. And we don't have anything, and Ravan, correct me if I'm wrong, with regards to this subject, right? So the data that is provided and that comes to StackState is the data that we deal with. However, there's a very important one. If we think about the pyramid, let me go back 2 slides. There's quite a bit of magic happening under the hood to start to overlay if data comes in from numerous sources about the same component. Let's say there's a workload running in AWS, whatever, and there are 2 ways to get to that data point. StackState have found a way to match that into a single component. And that is important because that brings you a much clearer and better understanding of how dependencies and components are dependent on each other. It's not entirely an answer to your question, but the data reliability as such, we're not dealing with that. The whole movement with OpenTelemetry, however, what we see happening is sparking very good conversations in engineering teams of where to pay attention to. And secondly, if you're making use of eBPF as a non-intrusive way to understand how components are dependent, that's also delivering very reliable data because it's fetched by the system and not necessarily created by humans. So these are the answers that I would give, and please leave your contact details if you want to go deeper, and we'll involve others on this subject. All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Meriem, for joining.
Thank you so much for having me and entertaining my questions. I know I had quite a bit of them, but it's brilliant to be able to take this back to the customers. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And I hope you enjoyed it as well. Have a good day. And if you're watching it later, definitely reach out to StackState. Drop me a message on LinkedIn. Would love to stay connected. Bye-bye.